there's been a lot of work being done by a lot
Hmm.
of people for a lot of years. I can imagine
Yeah.
that you said for the last 8 years, so it was
Hmm.
before the pandemic ever started, but we were already getting
Yeah.
into automation and robotics, and I can only imagine what those meetings might have been like once the pandemic hit and once the
Yeah.
workforce was really really needing the robotics. What can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So basically, how standards development works is you get together a committee of experts who, um, and you put them together in a room and have them discuss, well, what requirements should we put in this document? And so, especially when you're getting together with people from, 15 or 20 countries, it's really, really helpful to meet in person. So when you can, and I should also mention from the point of view of someone who's native English speaker and from the US, all ISO meetings are conducted in English. I can't even understand how they can do it. The tremendous respect to our committee members from other countries who are having these really long, involved technical discussions in what's not their first language. But when you can get together in person, it's easier to understand what's meant. You can it's easier to tell through people's body language when the greater clarification needs to be made in order for people to fully understand what we're talking about. And the other thing about in-person meetings is that it, the breaks are actually really important to the success of the meeting. When I first started in this job 9.5 years ago, I kind of thought of the breaks as sort of a necessary evil to getting the work done as biological human beings. Yes, you have to get coffee and you have to do other things. But actually during COVID, I came to realize that, in fact, the breaks were a really important part of getting the work done. And the reason for that is because if someone in the big meeting wasn't, fully following the discussion, or they thought it meant one thing when actually they were deeply agreeing with somebody else, and if they can, step aside during the break and have a smaller conversation, they can they can solve a lot of the problems and misunderstandings during those breaks. And also, we tend to have at least one social dinner, and you get to meet the people that you're working with, and see them as a truly as a person, and that helps you smooth over times when you disagree on concepts. I didn't realize until COVID how important it really was to have those in-person experiences. And once we had COVID, oh man, I have to tell you, some of these in-person meetings will often last, 3 days, or even in the case of these documents, they're very complex and in-depth documents. We actually met often for all 5 days of a week. So if you think about you're going into an in-person meeting, 8:30 in the morning to 5 p.m. in the local time, you're working a 40-hour week in this meeting. What we've discovered when COVID hit was to amass 40 hours worth of virtual meetings. It was almost impossible, actually, because as we all learned, there's a limit to the amount of time anyone can sit on a virtual call and actually focus on it. So, 2 hours, three, we tried to push it to three. Three is the absolute max, and you really get diminishing returns. So now you're talking about a series of 22-hour meetings to amass the same 40 hours you were spending in the in-person meeting. And during the course of those 22-hour meetings, you can't have them all in a single day. You can't have them even more than, say, 3 or 4 days a week, because since people aren't gone to Japan or wherever to focus entirely on this topic, they're getting pulled into other conversations. So you now have these 20 meetings that have to happen three times a week for however many weeks that is. I guess it's 7 or 8 weeks. So this effort that you used to come together and do a really intensive one week, you'd get a lot done. Now you're kind of stretching it out over 7 or 8 weeks. And what happens is, since you're breaking it up, you're meeting from 8:30 to 10, you're having a half hour break, and you're meeting from 10:30 to 12. that half-hour break isn't long enough to forget where you left the conversation. But when you're meeting on Monday and then again on Wednesday, you have to spend more of the time getting back into the discussion, getting your heads back in the concept. The other thing is that when you have flown halfway around the world, and despite the jet lag, you are on the local time and you're meeting at the time that makes sense for that local time. But when you're trying to have these virtual meetings and you have people located all around the world, actually, ISO has rules about how you can't always have it at 2 in the morning for some people. You have to rotate the times so that it's equally painful for everyone over the course of a series of meetings. And so, um, actually, it turns out that you can really only meet in the 4 hours between 6 a.m. Eastern time and 10 a.m. Eastern time because of what that means for other time zones around the world. And so, wow. So we were meeting at like from 5 to 8 a.m. for 3 times a week for 8 weeks.
So how did it affect, I'm sure it affected your meetings, like you just explained tremendously. But then how did it affect the meat of the standard itself? Because I would imagine that standard itself had to change a little bit based on the the fact that so many more collaborative robots or autonomous robots or all different sort of robotics now were being implemented even faster and more so than prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the content changed due to COVID, but the need for it definitely grew because, as you mentioned, the whole dynamic of um, increasing automation so as to reduce the disruption of the lack of human workers. Um, that was huge for our industry, huge. And then you have a lot of people who are first-time robotics users, and they don't necessarily know what the bigger companies that have been doing this for decades, they don't necessarily know what's best practice. And so, that the need to get this news out there and get it in people's hands and getting them to use it, that that's just grown along with the usage of robotics.